From the Daily Reporter, this is Ethan Duran. Welcome to Brews and Blueprints, a podcast about construction and development across Wisconsin. I'm Ethan Duran of the Daily Reporter, and I'm here with Benji Timm, the director of Port Milwaukee. Before being at Port Milwaukee, Benji was part of the City of Milwaukee Department of City Development, overseeing certain high-profile projects such as the Northridge Mall teardown, the Century City 1, and the 30th Street Industrial Corridor. I've seen Tim's name in many different stories chronicling the redevelopment and reintroduction of industrial and brownfield properties around Milwaukee into livable working spaces. Good morning, Benji. It's good to have you on. How are you doing?
I'm doing very well. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. Getting oriented here, can you tell me a little bit about your current role at Port of Milwaukee?
Sure. As port director, I oversee a staff of about 20 people, and I'm responsible for the day-to-day operations of a multimodal facility that serves customers worldwide. The port is roughly 460 acres. It's served by two Class 1 railroads and has more than 20 tenants. And these tenants range from commercial operations to military to recreational. Think about Milwaukee World Festivals or Summerfest. They're one of our tenants. The Lake Express High Speed Ferry, Discovery World Museum, among many others. We have 16 berths and cranes that can handle ocean-going vessels. These vessels typically carry steel, salt, concrete, gypsum, and agricultural products. And the port is once again exporting agricultural products to Europe, Northern Africa, and the Middle East. I was just in Chicago this past week talking a lot about soybeans and how Port Milwaukee can benefit Midwestern farmers. Uh, and then in addition to our commercial tenants, we also have three cruise ship docks. And this year is going to be a big year for us. We're hosting more than 60 cruise ship vessels, and we'll see about 20,000 passengers. So it's pretty exciting.
Is 60 a record for Milwaukee, by the way? How many do we service in the average year?
It is a record. The cruise ship industry or cruising industry in Milwaukee has been ramping up over the years. Uh, you know, Post COVID, it's been ramping up dramatically. And last year, I believe we received or there were about 23 vessels that called on Milwaukee. So it's a significant increase.
I mean, believe it or not, with Daily Reporter being a construction publication, we occasionally get news about new facilities in the Port Milwaukee. You mentioned soybeans. I think I remember not too long ago there was a new facility built for moving animal feed, for example. And I think they just mentioned like soybean is it's an essential crop to the Wisconsin economy and agricultural system in general. So do you have to learn a lot sort of on the seat of your pants, just about, these different resources and how they come in and out of the state and why that's important? Or did you feel like you had a lot of background knowledge coming into the role when you first started?
A little bit of both, actually. In terms of the agricultural products, I've had to learn quite a bit on the fly. The city of Milwaukee and Port Milwaukee worked with the DeLong company, and who combined we invested about $45 million in a new agricultural marine terminal that was specifically built and designed to manage various agricultural commodities and move them in and out of the port to world markets. That project started in about 2020, and so far it's exceeded all expectations. And in fact, the DeLong company just completed phase two of the project by adding two additional silos to the property, which can handle additional commodities. And really, the share of the material that's been leaving the port recently has been DDGs. Those are distilled grains that are part of the ethanol process. They're a byproduct of the ethanol process, but they're purchased by buyers in Europe, Northern Africa, and sometimes the Middle East for animal feed. And so, with the new silos coming online, DeLong will be able to handle multiple commodities. So not just DDGs, but also corn, soybeans, wheat, and other things as well. So Milwaukee started as a grain port, in the 1830s and 1840s, and we were one of the biggest grain exporters in the world for a while. That that trended down for a long time, and dried up a few years ago completely, but now we're ramping back up and exporting a lot out of the St. Lawrence Seaway.
Another sort of construction related question for you. I know that, the new administration, current administration, that tariffs have been a big part of the conversation around construction. Materials like aluminum, steel, even the price of oil and diesel are sort of contributing factors that many builders say is driving up construction costs. Would this apply to Port of Milwaukee in the idea of construction materials come in at higher prices now? Like, how does that sort of play a role in sort of the materials you're handling now? Or do you feel like that does not apply? Because we've mentioned many like agricultural commodities right now, but I just want to be sure I'm not leaving anything out.
The tariffs are definitely a factor. They're certainly on everyone's mind, and they're impacting every aspect of our lives and businesses. Everyone's looking for predictability in their business so they can make decisions, particularly long-term decisions. And the frequent fluctuations and decisions and announcements that have been happening with tariffs have just kind of thrown everything into chaos. And Port Milwaukee, some of our tenants were significantly impacted last year with tariffs, and in certain cases, their businesses were down as much as 30%. In other cases, Port Milwaukee actually benefited from the tariffs because we import a lot of steel from Europe for the canning industry, the food canning industry. And steel producers were trying to beat the tariffs, beat the start of the tariffs. And so they front loaded a lot of their product for the consumer. And our warehouses have been busting at the seams because we got a lot of steel up front. So actually in 2025, our numbers are really good. Now that may kick us in the pants in 2026 when we're not seeing as much steel because we kind of have a glut of it right now. Um, so, but and then in other cases, um, like with the building industry and trades and raw materials, it has made an impact in terms of how people are buying, where they're buying it from. And then also with salt, you drive over the home bridge and you see the giant piles of salt at the port, which we import salt for the entire state of Wisconsin, northeastern Illinois, and in some cases Minnesota and Iowa as well. So we're really a regional hub for salt. That's why you see so much of it. And the salt is not only for road and winter conditions, but it is also a component in animal feeds, and it's also a component in water softeners for hard water, places that have hard water. So it serves a lot of purposes. But the reason I'm talking about salt right now is that a lot of our salt, I believe about 70% of it comes from Canada. So there are salt mines underneath Lake Erie, and a lot of our salt comes from Ontario, and that can be tariffs on salt. So that raises the cost of salt, and you know it hits you in ways you don't necessarily think of it.
I imagine, if you want to salt the roads and let, say, trucks moving materials come through, that might be a potential problem, just sort of freestyling off the top of my head. And speaking of, and this is a couple of years now, but I remember reading about the Neutral project, how they wanted to build a mass timber tower in Milwaukee, and that project is paused now. But I remember in one of their investor emails, the CEO of the company was talking about shipping in timber from Austria because they have a pretty good connection in Europe that gets them the mass timber that is needed for cross-laminated timber building. You know, do you see materials like that coming in that, yeah, I guess another question is like, where does the tariff itself come in as a price point? Or what point of the logistics chain does the tariff play a role in? Does that happen when the boat actually comes into the port of Milwaukee, or does it happen at sea back at home where it's being imported from? Like where does the port play a role exactly when these tariffs come into play?
The tariffs hit the material as soon as they hit a port in the U.S. And then it's typically the entity or the person buying the materials that is responsible for paying the tariff. So, we as consumers are actually paying for the tariff. It's not the producer in another country. It's actually us paying for it. So it's tariffs are an important tool and they can be used in very strategic ways to benefit us. But in the ways they're currently being implemented or were being implemented, it is not helping our economy or users right now. So it's typically something we've seen on the back end. And so that's again back to that predictability element. People want to see that, want to be able to plan on that. When you have materials that leave, Europe at one price, and then there's tariffs there's tariffs engaged as that boat's traveling across the ocean, and then when they hit our shores, they're at a different price. $15,000 more, $20,000 more, because the tariffs that were added or percentages that were added during the transit, that's significant, and that can have a big impact on business, and it can kill projects. Going back to the timber frame buildings, Port Milwaukee does manage project cargo, and for Tim Gockman's timber frame high rise downtown, that timber came in through Port Milwaukee. We also receive hulls for yachts, as well as vessels for brewing industry, a lot of specialized cargo. So in addition to our commodities, we're also importing specialized cargo as well.
That's an interesting name to bring up. And it's a little before my time, but for our listeners' purposes, Tim Gockman, the developer behind the Ascent, which held the world record for tallest mass timber building for a few years now. I believe they're building something in Sydney, Australia, that's going to be 50 stories. So, there's this race to the top of the whole mass timber industry. And it's interesting seeing where we're learning about where different materials come from in Wisconsin building. Anyway, I know there's a lot of Northwoods timber that plays a good role in residential construction. So it's exciting to learn about how the Port of Milwaukee plays a role in some of these construction projects being built. But Benji, you also mentioned a little bit about the salt being impacted by the tariffs, and I just wanted to hear a little more about that. Take that idea a little further, if you are so willing. Yeah, tell us a little bit about its role and importance for the rest of the state, please.
Yeah, I mean, it just can increase the amount per ton. So you when a buyer, whether it's a municipality or a private company, buys the commodity, they buy it at a certain price, or they anticipate that they need to buy X number of tons next year for the winter or for their feed or for whatever they're using it for. And when a new tariff is added or the percentage is ramped up, that changes everyone's calculation. It changes profitability. If you're a public municipality, you have a finite budget, and those costs are unanticipated. And so, do municipalities or states have to borrow more to account for those changes? What do they basically cut off, or what programs, or do they, ramp down in order to, buy something as essential as salt for road and highway safety? So it's always this kind of balancing act, and I'll just kind of circle back to the predictability aspect. Everybody's looking for that.
Yes, and I apologies in advance if this feels like a business 101 seminar for me. That's kind of how these episodes turn out sometimes, but I appreciate you bearing with me on this.
Never stop learning.
Never stop learning. Let's shift the conversation a little bit. Obviously I love to talk about projects,
Sure.
and what I want to kind of steer us towards is talking about your role in the Department of City Development. Now, you had been there for quite a while, and I think maybe summing up it in one title is a little bit short, but can you tell me a little bit about your responsibilities at the DCD and, how that differs from Port Director now?
Sure. Yeah, I work for both the Redevelopment Authority of the City of Milwaukee and the Department of City Development for about 24 years. In a lot of ways, those entities are kind of intertwined and inseparable. But they both have different abilities and different authorities that they can use to make projects happen. So I felt very fortunate to work for both entities. All in all, though, I really did the same thing. So I worked for the real estate division, doing primarily brownfield redevelopment, and I worked with an industrial development. So that's where most of my focus was over those years. And in a lot of ways, a lot of my responsibilities at the port today are very similar to my responsibilities at DCD. Both departments manage tenants. Both departments are engaged in economic development. Both departments, have are engaged in like big picture, long term planning. So in a lot of ways, my transition to the port was relatively smooth. I knew who the players were. I know the politics, and I have this background and I also have connections, which made things easier. Um, so there's a lot of opportunities with both agencies, and I feel very fortunate too that I have that connection between the Department of City Development and Port Milwaukee now because, in the past we've worked together on a variety of projects, whether it was Komatsu or the DeLong facility. We worked on these larger scale economic development investments in the community, in job creation, in new development, new construction, and so how I'm working on ways to strengthen that right now. So DCD Commissioner Lafayette Crump and Dave Miskey from the Redevelopment Authority and I work very closely together, and we talk a few times a week. So it's an even closer relationship now, and what I hope to do is to leverage that into more economic development opportunities. Because we're all in different rooms talking to different people, and how do we use this relationship to make it better for Milwaukee, for our residents, for our community, for our businesses? And I think there's a lot of opportunity from the economic development standpoint, but then there's also a lot of opportunity from the environmental cleanup standpoint as well. Both departments are working on the Milwaukee Estuary Area of Concern cleanup, which is cleaning up all the sediment in our three river system in Milwaukee Bay, and that's going to create improved environmental conditions. We're going to make swimmable, fishable waters. We're also adding 40 acres to the city of Milwaukee. We're building a new dredge materials management facility. Again, if you drive south over the Home Bridge, you see the facility being constructed at the south end. That's where the dredge material from the rivers and the harbor area are going to go, and ultimately that'll create 40 acres for the city of Milwaukee. And that'll be a few years out. Probably not in my career here at the city of Milwaukee, but for the next port director. But where the Lake Express high speed ferry is, and where the new cruise ship dock is being constructed right now, that's all on combined disposal facilities. So that's all on areas that were filled with dredge materials in the past that is now usable land. So again, you know, taking care of a problem, whether it's an environmental problem or a hindrance to navigation, we're managing the sediments, putting into another place, and then creating new land and new opportunity for economic development. And so the Department of City Development and Port Milwaukee have been working very closely in that regard.
Uh, just to bring this back to getting to know you more, Benji, and pardon me for not asking at the get-go, but did you work in the private sector ever before you did public service? And also, what's your alma mater?
Sure. S- I'll go way back. So my family operated a hardware store for 165 years in Two Rivers. So I grew up essentially in a hardware store. And then my dad operated a small general contracting business. So from the time I was 10 or 11, I was, stocking shelves, helping customers, um, replacing roofs, pouring driveways, or building a garage, which did a number of things. One, it really instilled a work ethic in me, but two, it gave me a sense of how to work with people, how to problem solve, and then how businesses work too. I think that's very important to understand and to see that from the inside. And so I grew up in Two Rivers, Wisconsin, right up the lakefront from here. And then I went to school at the University of Wisconsin Milwaukee. And initially, I went to school for museum science. So anthropology and history were my focus. And I worked for the public museum for about a year and then decided that that wasn't really what I wanted to do and ended up starting an internship with the city of Milwaukee, doing land use investigations, looking for environmental liability, which was definitely more of a fit. And then I had started a graduate program in urban studies at UWM and got hired full time by DCD during that process and ceased my graduate program and started working for the Department of City Development, and the rest is kind of history.
Wow. I mean, hey, they're building a new museum, so
Yeah.
want to switch when that's completed. That's always an option. Well, taking it back to duties at DCD, when you were, I think around the time you transitioned to Port Milwaukee, one of the high profile projects you were part of was the demolition of Northridge Mall, which had been caught in court for so many years. And it was just a whole media spectacle just seeing whether that thing was going to get torn down or not. I mean, not just in the press and TV stations, but on social media as well. I believe someone quoted this, so I'm taking this from another news writer, but it was a Casey Neistat video that
Oh yes.
kind of put the mall into the spotlight, and then it became sort of a resource question of, trying to word this better, but people kept going in. There were fires. Firefighters would go in, and it was too dangerous to even deal with. That's just when the mall was still standing. And I want to ask you, Benji, what was it like? What managing the actual tear down? Like, what were the inside challenges of organizing that particular demolition job?
Yes. So the part of my role at the Department of City Development was taking on special projects. Projects essentially that were very complex. They had legal challenges, as you just mentioned, and there wasn't necessarily a clear timeline in sight. It was kind of like whether there's Northridge or Century City or the Kneeland Properties or some of the other projects that I worked on, I looked at them as a puzzle where, there were a lot of pieces scattered around the board and you had to figure out how to put them all back together. And in some cases, the pieces were missing. The Northridge Mall was probably one of the most complex sites I ever worked on. Not from an environmental standpoint, not from an infrastructure standpoint, but mostly from a legal standpoint. Now, you'd mentioned our legal challenges with the former owner and some of the health and safety issues that revolved around them and their time with the mall. That was certainly challenging to deal with that. I've never been in court so often in my life. That was an interesting time. But there's also a lot of legal complexity around ownership and around shared utilities and around just how the mall functions because it was a private property that became public. The ring road surrounding the mall was a road that was built as a private development. It was actually a parcel that was ultimately converted into a public right of way. And so you think of a mall, you go to the traditional mall and you see this kind of monolithic building with all these stores in it, and most people don't think about who owns that. And in the case of the former Northridge Mall, you had 4 property owners who owned the actual mall building itself. So you have the standalone kind of big box or bigger box retail, like the J.C. Penney, the Yonkers, the Sears, Boston store, things like that. Those were all owned by separate entities. And then you had the main mall corridor, which was owned by yet another entity. So the city got involved in the project in a number of ways, trying to redevelop it with, at one time with Penzi Spices, at another time with an entity who was looking at turning into a trade operation. But ultimately, the city came to own the former Boston store, which was one piece of that pie. But they were all connected. There are very complex legal agreements that bind all these properties together with easements, covenants, utilities, insurance, shared maintenance responsibilities, all of these things. And then when you have one entity that doesn't follow through with their obligations, it becomes a problem. And basically, the complexity came in unwrapping all of that and then trying to kind of clean it up to set the stage for a new development. So the demolition aspect, it was a big project. It had a big cost to it. That was primarily due to asbestos abatement and some of the environmental costs, not necessarily the structure or anything like that. It was a relatively simple structure, but most of the budget went into asbestos abatement.
And bee removal.
MV removal,
Oh,
yes, yes.
I-
As a former beekeeper, that was kind of an interesting part of it. So, and I'm glad Balistrary was able to um, capture the two hives and rehome them.
and we were able to try some of that during the I think they handed out some during one of the press conferences outside. I do remember trying some of that, so
Yeah,
appreciated.
I give them a
Uh,
lot of points for marketing creativity.
oh yeah. That it sounds like you've had a lot of different you mentioned, growing up, your father was in general contracting and you did a little bit of I think concrete work you mentioned, and now we're just learning you were a beekeeper. You have a lot of different experiences. That must certainly help for the job that you have to do. Do you think? Just having these, you kind of understand the labor aspect of the construction, and you can take it up a higher level than that, and take it even higher economic development. You're looking at the whole city ecosystem. Um, what's your perspective on that? Working in Milwaukee.
Yeah, I love to learn. I love dynamic environments. I like things that are interesting. Some of the reasons that I took on the projects that I did at DCD were specifically because they were complex and they had lots of components and there were so many unknowns associated with them. And so to kind of dig into that information, to dig into the details, the documents, to talk to residents, to talk to people who used to work at these facilities, that was all part of it was like almost in a way a research project, but it also helped make the project real. It brought it home. I was able to be kind of empathetic in some ways when dealing with residents who live adjacent to the property and have had to deal with a lot of circumstances and conditions, but then also to understand, how whether it was a facility, a school, impacted the neighborhood and kind of helped to create the neighborhood. So really digging into a project, figuring out all the layers, learning it, and then trying to put it back together. That really is important to me. And it becomes in some cases personal, and you want to see it through. You want to see success. You want to see things happen.
Let's talk about some of the other projects you've been involved in, and feel free to correct me anytime. These were just things I pulled up from the Daily Reporter website and other places as well. So information might be a little old or maybe outdated. So feel free to correct me anytime. But for example, the Kneeland Properties in Menominee Valley, if I understand, there's been a lot of eyes and speculation of what's going to be built there. Can you tell me about working on that specific project?
Well, let's step back a little bit and talk about, all of the projects or a lot of the projects that I work on too.
Mhm.
They 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 they're not they're not functioning in the marketplace the way they should. there's either environmental contamination, or there's no infrastructure, or there's something holding them back from fully participating in the marketplace, in the private sector, public sector, whatever they're intended to be. And oftentimes the city has to come in and kind of be that bridge to clean up or kind of fix whatever problems are there to kind of set the stage for their next life, for their evolution. And so the Kneeland Properties, that property goes back to the beginning of Milwaukee. Historically, it was a canal. It was the Kneeland Canal. So where the alley is now on the north side of the Kneeland Properties, which, for those of you who don't know, there's about 10 acres of land that's undeveloped underneath the Marquette interchange, and it's in the Menominee Valley, adjacent to on the north side of the Menominee River. And it never really was improved. It never really was developed. It was a coal yard. It was a junkyard, and it sat underutilized for many years. The canal that existed was filled in primarily during the time of the Marquette interchange, when it was originally constructed in the 1950s and 1960s, and it became an alley. So it was never plumbed with utility. There's utilities were never installed, sewer, water, gas, all the things that you need to make a property functional. So I had started working on this maybe 10 or 12 years ago, to try and figure out how to bring new utilities into that area, how to activate the space. And Menominee Valley Partners had created the Menominee Valley 2.0 plan, and they had designated this area for light industrial uses. They highlighted food and beverage as kind of their priority user down there. So that kind of gave us a game plan, that gave us kind of a sense of what we were shooting for, and then we could plan infrastructure around that. Now, the site is very complex, from an environmental standpoint, from a geotechnical standpoint. It's basically filled marsh area. But then there's also, because the area was never really developed, everybody put their infrastructure in there. So you have sewers from the Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewerage District. You have sewers from the city of Milwaukee Public Works. You have a lot of electrical utilities. We Energies has steam lines that run through there from their steam plant in the Menominee Valley that feed all of the high-rise buildings downtown. So there's just a lot of things going on down there, and you had to untangle it in order to kind of plan for new infrastructure. It's taken so long, or it's taken a long time to get to the point of now we're ready for construction, trying to work through all those challenges. And then not only what's underground, you have the Marquette interchange above ground, which is the state of Wisconsin's busiest highway interchange. And both the Wisconsin Department of Transportation as well as the U.S. Department of Transportation are very, concerned about what happens in and around that interchange, because if anything were to happen to that, it would have a significant impact on the region. So we had to work very closely with those two entities too, to make sure that what we were planning for that area was not a risk and not going to harm or create any potential harm to their infrastructure. So it's going to be about a $5 million project. We are going to the city of Milwaukee is going to put in new roads, new sewer, water, gas, sidewalks, pavement, and create two new development pads, which one will be about 8 acres and the other one will be about 2 acres. And the 8-acre site could be developed as one larger parcel or two smaller parcels. And I believe the city's looking at doing an RFP later this year if all goes well.
That's exciting to hear. I was going to ask if the DCD was courting developers right now, but that's more of a question for DCD currently. But I appreciate the update.
Yeah, the catch is right now to make sure that we can build the roads, get the utilities in. So I'm still engaged a little bit with the Department of City Development in the process, just because I'm basically the institutional knowledge, and so we work closely together on it. And the goal, we want to make sure that we have all the infrastructure in place before we start marketing it, or at least have started to put it in place.
Okay. Let's shift again. Another project I was looking at was Century City 1. If you're driving, up and down Capitol in Milwaukee, you might see this new structure just off of the road. I think it was near a former A.O. Smith, historic Milwaukee company, site not too long ago. Um, but that at least the first phase has been built out since the late 2010s. Benji, do you want to sort of revisit the project and tell me, sort of the gist and what the next steps are?
Sure, happy to. Yeah, so the Century City Business Park, as you mentioned, was formerly the A.O. Smith complex, and then it was Tower Automotive prior to becoming the Century City Business Park. And when A.O. Smith and Tower Automotive operated it, it was a 150-acre facility on both sides of the 30th Street Rail Corridor, which runs north and south perpendicular to Capitol Drive. And in 2009, the Redevelopment Authority of the City of Milwaukee acquired 86 acres of that 150-acre site and essentially started tearing down most of the buildings, although we did an assessment to figure out what buildings could be retained and which buildings had to go. And there was about 350,000 square feet that was retained for the Talgo property. There's a company, Talgo, who builds passenger rail cars. They operate in what we call Building 36, and they have about 120 employees near 27th and Townsend. The rest of the site was cleared above ground and below ground. There was a considerable amount of environmental cleanup that had to take place to make that happen. We pulled out sewers, we pulled out building foundations, um, machine pads, and if for anyone listening who can remember what the A.O. Smith facility looked like, it had some taller buildings that went up 5, 6, 7 stories in some cases. And many of those buildings went as far underground as they went above ground. So it was no small feat to get that infrastructure out of there. And that started in about 2009, and we went through the demolition process. Well, first Talgo came in 2010, and so we got them set up, and they began operating in late 2010. And then we continued with demolition environmental cleanup, basically 2011 through about 2013, 2014. The Century City 1 building, which is located at 31st and Capitol, is a 50,000 foot flex industrial building. And we wanted to kind of plant a flag in the ground and make an investment in the property to kind of get the ball rolling for future development. And the city of Milwaukee partnered with the General Capital Group to build that building. And that came online in about 2015, and there were a number of users in there, both temporary at first, and now there are 6 full-time users. The building is full, who operate in the building. And then we began marketing the rest of the property for redevelopment. And we've had some ups and downs with that over time, but there's certainly interest. It's the largest contiguous parcel right now in the city of Milwaukee that's slated for heavy industrial use. Um, the city of Milwaukee, while it has a lot of industrial properties, it doesn't have a lot of large parcels. So where you see industrial growth in the region, you're seeing it in kind of the ex-urban area, in the areas along the I-94, I-43 corridors. The city of Milwaukee really doesn't have large scale parcels, and that's why the Center City Business Park is important. It's also why the Northridge property is important too. It allows us to grow. It allows us to attract new companies, larger companies to the city of Milwaukee. And so with Century City, the, the city could have filled that site up a dozen times over with kind of low intensity uses. There's a lot, concrete crushing, trailer parking, warehousing, storage, things like that. However, we have the ability to utilize basically patient capital and wait for the right user to come along. So that's why, there's been some fits and starts with some of the companies we've been talking to, and that's why some of it is still open and available, is because we're waiting for the right user that's going to have a big impact on that area. That area was a significant manufacturing hub in the region and the state, and we want to make sure that whoever invests in that next is the right person and is going to help that area grow and evolve.
Now, another sort of economic development project I was thinking about was the 30th Street Industrial Corridor. Now, does that have intersections with the other projects we mentioned, Century City or, um, A.O. Smith or any other industrial redevelopment we're thinking about?
Yes, the Center City Business Park is part of the 30th Street corridor. The 30th Street corridor it's about a 5 mile segment that runs north and south through the heart of Milwaukee, and it's essentially a rail line that is straddled by industrial properties on either side. And you think of the evolution of the city, the port area where I am now, this was the first area to be developed. This was the hub of commerce, it was the hub of logistics, it was how goods and services came in and out of the city. So the port is the oldest kind of industrial area, if you will. And then you move into the Menominee Valley, which is a little bit newer, 1890s, 1920s, 1930s. And then as, railroads became more prevalent, the 30th Street Corridor is kind of the next evolution of that. And so as we look to reinvent, to reinvigorate these areas of the city, we've had great success in the harbor, in the valley, and we want to replicate a lot of that in the 30th Street corridor and other industrial districts throughout the city. The 30th Street corridor is a very dynamic place. It's if you look at Century City toward the northern end of the corridor, it's a vastly different environment, physical environment at that end of the corridor versus the southern end of the corridor where you had the former Esser Paint facility. The southern end of the corridor is a lot denser. The properties are a lot tighter. The industrial parcels are a lot smaller. So we started the 30th Street Corridor Initiative as an overall kind of investigation and assessment of what assets and opportunities exist there, but then also, what are the current economic trends? What are the opportunities that we have moving forward? And some of that involved changing land use. If I mentioned the former Esser Paint site, that was a paint company, but the parcels were very small. Everything was clustered very tightly around the rail corridor. In some cases, the rail corridor was there's a 15 to 20 foot elevation difference between the rail corridor and street grade. So from a thinking about that as reinvigorating that, reinventing that as an industrial property didn't make as much sense because modern manufacturing takes trucking. It takes most people don't live in the area where they work anymore, so you need parking, you need loading docks, you need all the elements of modern manufacturing. So we really worked to clean up the site and transition that area into more housing, which was more needed in that area at the time. And then as you go north in the 30th Street corridor, the parcels get a bigger. The former master lock facilities included in the 30th Street corridor. Um, we talked about A.O. Smith, Tar Automotive, Century City. There's also portion larger parcels going north. So really kind of looking at what the area is, and you think about these areas, people came into an area to work, and oftentimes when they were developed, they lived in the same neighborhood, they went to church in the same neighborhood, their kids went to school in the same neighborhood. That doesn't exist as much anymore, but there are still residential neighborhoods directly across the street from these sites, the manufacturing sites. There's commercial corridors that cut through them. So really looking at the city's toolbox and working with all the city's departments, figuring out how we plug in our tools and create opportunities for new investment in these areas. So the 30th Street corridor, it's a large area. It's very dynamic, and there's a lot of different ways where investments can be made. And we've had successes, but we've also had challenges too. Probably the biggest blow was Master Lock leaving. That was significant because they were the largest employer in that area. So, but then at Century City, you have 500 people who report to work there every day, between the 8 or 9 companies that are there, as well as the city of Milwaukee's Department of Public Works facility. So, while that area is not what it was when A.O. Smith was there, when he had 10,000 employees, it's there's still activity, there's still life, and there's definitely opportunity.
think the Master Lock example is interesting. I could have maybe even led with that because I feel like that's such a big name in Milwaukee as well. Um, can you tell me, is that particular site being eyed for development or redevelopment of any kind right now? I feel like there was maybe a story or two about that a year ago, but it's been a minute since I've heard about it.
Yeah, that's an interesting story. The Master Lock Corporation basically divested their interest in the property, and they sold to an entity that basically comes in, they take on the environmental liability, they clean up the site, and then they typically sell it off for other uses. And I know they're in the process right now of doing some of the environmental remediation, of cleaning it up, and I believe also looking for new opportunities, new uses. I haven't been as close to that project since I've come over to the port, but so I don't know exactly what the latest is, but that there definitely is opportunity there.
No problem. The last one I wanted to go over is a little bit obscure, and it may have grown into something since it was visited back in 2018. But I'd caught an article by former Daily reporter Nate Beck about a federal grant from the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency to clean up the Grand Trunk wetland, which is one of the last remaining wetlands in Milwaukee. And as someone who's worked in economic development, urban planning studies, and a little bit of environmental remediation work as well, from your time at DCD, are there any updates on what happened with the Grand Trunk? Was that turned into anything else? What did that grant essentially do since the year it was since it was awarded?
Yeah, so this falls into the category of a complex project. One of the puzzles I like to work on. Actually, Grand Trunk Wetland is still a project. It's still happening, and that's one of the things that I took with me from the Department of City Development to Port Milwaukee. It's actually land that is controlled by the port. So I was working on behalf of the port in 2018 to basically re reinvent Grand Trunk. So the Grand Trunk site was historically a rail yard that was used to load rail cars onto ferries and send them across Lake Michigan. And there was a wetland kind of in the middle of it. Historically, that was all marshland before it was filled for industrial purposes. But there was a wetland area that kind of persisted, from the beginning of Milwaukee, the city of Milwaukee, to till now. And as part of the Milwaukee Estuary Area of Concern cleanup, I mentioned that earlier in the conversation. That's a significant project that's happening right now with a number of non-federal sponsors, including Milwaukee County Parks, We Energies, City of Milwaukee, and Milwaukee Metropolitan Sewage District, as well as the Wisconsin DNR. And there's the waterway cleanup of sediments in our waterways in Milwaukee Harbor. But as part of that too, there's also habitat restoration projects as well. And the Grand Trunk wetland is a habitat restoration component of the Milwaukee Estuary AOC cleanup. The couple of things have happened with Grand Trunk since that time is we found hazardous levels of PCBs in the slip that outfalls into the Kinnickinnick River. And so that's one of the constituents that we want to clean up as part of the AOC cleanup. However, we identified an active source for those PCBs. So the city of Milwaukee is working with the Wisconsin Department of Natural Resources, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and private landowners in that area to address the ongoing contamination. And essentially, the wetland restoration project cannot move forward until we address the ongoing contamination. So that's kind of where things are right now. It's still moving forward, albeit a little bit slower. Also, kind of subsequent or to the Grand Trunk Wetland project, Michaels Corporation also entered into a long-term lease with Port Milwaukee, and they developed a marine operation and also an aggregate handling facility on the Grand Trunk parcels. So there's an active user on the property right now. Simultaneously, there's this habitat restoration project happening. And again, with the urban fabric, you're trying to knit all these different uses together and make everything work. So someday there will be there will be new habitat there. There will be likely river walk and recreational opportunities, but then there'll also be, commercial operations, whether it's Michael's Corporation, someone else, or one of the marinas in the area. So there's a lot going on down there.
It's quite the example of the amount of overlap that can happen with one of these projects, especially, as you mentioned, land use, ownership, and what takes place on it. But that's always been an interesting part of this beat for sure. And
Sure.
I'm sure, as you kind of alluded to, these are the challenges you sort of like to get into. Um, I want to ask, before we sign off here, I have a couple more questions, but, from switching your role from DCD to port director, what are some lessons learned or skills transferred from that previous role that you're bringing in? I know you sort of answered that in a long way through the duration of this podcast, but I'd be happy to hear it again in a nutshell.
Yeah, I think, partnerships are key in all circumstances, building trust, basically thinking about how other people are perceiving things as well. So there's an empathy component to it too. Um, and then communication are that's a skill that's needed, whether you're managing a team of people internally like at the port, or you're communicating with neighbors throughout the city, or contractors, or anyone else. So there definitely is a lot of overlap between the departments and what we do. We all work for the city. Port Milwaukee is a department of the city of Milwaukee. We work for the mayor. So this is we're all one city, working toward the same goals.
Of the projects we've talked about or may not have talked about during this episode, are there any that we should keep an eye on? What's going to stay relevant for the next few years? And is there a longer way than saying all of them? Because it sounds like all of them.
That would have been my first answer. Yes, all of them. I think the Northridge Mall property is certainly evolving pretty quickly, and you'll see some movement on that. Um, Century City, there's always opportunities, as we talked about. We're using patient capital, and we want to find the right user for the right space. So, that'll be something significant. And then here at the port, we have our agricultural facility, which, we're looking at ways to grow that and create more opportunity here. We're looking at investing in new warehousing operations at the port, so that we can handle more commodities, and bring in more products to the city. So, I think all of these projects, but there's different elements in each of them that are going to be kind of popping at different times, and that's what makes it exciting. So the projects are all very long term, but when something happens, it's significant. It makes a mark on the city.
Well, I'll certainly keep my eyes and ears open for the next update. Well, Benji, I'm out of questions here. It's been a great time having you on, and we really appreciate your time. Were there any final thoughts, anything else to know or share before we sign off here?
I think just surround yourself with good people, talented people, and never stop learning. That's what makes things interesting.
All right, good advice. All right, thanks so much, Benji.
Thanks.